Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do a book review of The Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham. And I think I've had my copy, this old mangled up paperback, I don't know, blue covered Penguin Classics copy for 20 years without ever having read it. But several channels I follow, From the Dusty Bookshelf, Amy from the Dusty Bookshelf, and Alan Morton, whose channel has the same name, have been talking about W. Somerset Maugham quite a bit lately. So I decided to take the book off my shelf and read it this month, and get one of those books that has been on my shelf for a long time taken care of. And I'm really glad that I did, and thanks to those two channels for inspired me to read it. Somerset Maugham was an incredibly successful playwright and novelist during the mid-20th century, even though today I don't think he's talked about very often, and I'm not sure how much his books are read. The Razor's Edge is essentially a novel about a young man named Larry Darrell who grows up in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago among families of great wealth, even though he himself is an orphan. In lots of ways, he's a child of privilege. His childhood sweetheart is a young woman named Isabel, and it's pretty much predestined, it seemed like, that they will grow up and marry. When World War I breaks out, Larry Darrell goes to Canada, and even though he's not really 18 years old, he gets his uncle, who is his guardian, to say that he was, and he ends up fighting in World War I as a fighter pilot in the skies over the Western Front. And that experience changes him profoundly, as it did for lots of young men who went off to fight in World War I. He comes back to Chicago and kind of rejoins the life that he left behind, but his war experiences have changed them, and he can't just go back to the path his life was on. He can't just go back to the idea of working and making money. And this is upsetting to Isabel and her family, to whom he had been engaged. Larry explains the situation to Isabel and says he needs a couple years to try to sort out in his mind what's happening, and he goes off to Paris, leaving Isabel behind. He is on a quest for meaning, apparently, in his life, a quest for understanding of the world, of life, of God, of himself, of his position, of what he should do, of right and wrong. He's on a quest for all those things, and he leaves Isabel behind in Chicago. Isabel and her family eventually make a trip to Paris, where they're going to stay with her rich uncle Elliot Templeton in his incredibly stylish Paris apartment, and she meets with Larry again. By now, Larry has devoted himself to study and to learning languages. He lives in an impoverished area of Paris, in incredibly poor circumstances. He still wants to marry Isabel. He wants her to join him in this life, in this quest for knowledge and truth and understanding. He has a small income from the inheritance from his family, which he says they could support themselves on. But Isabel doesn't want that life. She was born to privilege. She's born to wealth and comfort. And even for Larry, who she definitely loves passionately, she's not willing to give that up. In addition to that, as she'll say later, she's not willing just to be an accessory to a man traveling all over the place searching for truth, a man searching for some kind of inner or outward holiness. That doesn't appeal to her. So they break off their engagement, and Isabel marries Larry's best friend, a wealthy young man named Gray, and she enjoys the life of wealth and privilege until the Great Depression of 1929 destroys her family's wealth, and she ends up back in Paris, where on again, off again, she and Gray and Larry meet up and learn more and more about one another's lives. The novel really surrounds three primary characters. I've mentioned all three before. The first is Elliot Templeton. Elliot Templeton is an American snob working his way up the social ladder of European society, family by family, acquaintance by acquaintance, connection by connection. He is a defender of the old ways of European life and of European society. He defends those rules which he's learned so that he can move forward. He is on a quest for social status and for acceptance and to preserve that old world, and he will achieve a lot of success, but ultimately be disappointed because of the changes that World War I and the Great Depression brought to the world. By the time he achieves his goal is essentially meaningless. Isabel is a character who is struggling with twin desires: her passion for Larry and her desire to live comfortably and to be happy and to be, wealthy and to enjoy all the privileges of wealth. When she and Larry break off their engagement, she chooses wealth, comfort, happiness over passion. She loves Gray, but she doesn't love her husband passionately. And then Larry is on a spiritual quest for meaning, for understanding, for God. He travels the world. He travels across Europe. He spends a lot of time in India, becoming acquainted with Hinduism, learning foreign languages, and eventually he comes to terms with his place in the world, and he finds peace in his belief system. And that belief system and that sense of inner peace makes him unusual and someone who stands out. So this obviously sets up a real kind of conflict, several conflicts between Larry and Isabel, which, work their way out over the course of the novel. It was kind of slow to get into for me, and at first it just felt like, just a traditional story of a kind of a love triangle, maybe structured a little unusually from the point of view of an outside observer, but it really became much more powerful and meaningful, and the depth of the novel kind of dawns on you as it goes on. There are three unusual things I think about the novel. Number one, Maugham makes himself a character in the book. He is the observer of these, three people, of Elliot, of Isabel, of Larry. And he has a grudging admiration for all three, even though he sees flaws in all three. He thinks that Larry is naive and sometimes a fool. He thinks that Isabel is cold and calculating. He thinks that Elliot is a snob, but at the same time he recognizes that Elliot is incredibly generous to his family and to his friends and to the people who've worked for them, and that there's an innate generosity and goodness to his spirit that makes him a much sweeter character than you might imagine. He appreciates Isabel's independence, her fiery temper, her physical beauty, even though he accuses her of lacking passion and being cold. He appreciates that kind of strangeness in Larry that sets him apart. And he observes all three of these characters, and it's through him that we learn about them. But he himself, like I said, is a character. He doesn't just narrate, he participates, he acts, he expresses opinions. And one of the things I think is most unusual is that Maugham doesn't always come off as a likable person. Sometimes he's too cynical, sometimes he's too cruel, sometimes he's too judgmental. And just like the other characters, there's another side where he's accepting and wise and reasonable and right and forgiving and compassionate. It really is interesting. And second, despite the traditional sounding beginnings of the book contains incredibly frank discussions of sex and of female desire and of how women think about sex and passion and love, and the distinction between passion and love, and whether you can love without passion, and what passion does in terms of the destruction, or what it leads to in terms of destruction. That kind of foreshadows a lot of the plot twists, and it really, in the midpoint, feels like an incredibly modern novel discussing all those issues in a way which seems, a little straightforward when you think that the book, I think, was published in 1943. And then the third thing I thought was really kind of unusual, or maybe not unusual, but interesting, is that in lots of ways, Paris is the fourth, maybe the fifth character in the book. That we go from one end of Paris to the other. We experience Paris at high society levels and at the lowest levels of Parisian society. And that we go from one neighborhood to another and one situation to another. It really is fascinating. And what it reminded me of in that way was Hemingway's A Movable Feast, and it made me wonder if Hemingway had read The Razor's Edge before. You should be getting the impression, I hope, that I really enjoyed the novel much more than I thought I would at the beginning. It is a novel that grew on me a great deal, and I'm really glad that I read this, what I consider to be a fairly unusual mid-20th century book. So if you're looking for kind of a forgotten classic and an author who, has probably been neglected over the last, let's say, 20 or 30 years, W. Somerset Maugham definitely seems like that author, and The Razor's Edge is a book I think that is definitely worth reading. So I think this is a very good book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Anyway, if you've read Maugham, if you've read The Razor's Edge, love to hear from you in the comments section or anything else you want to talk about, and as always, thank you for watching.